So the first component we're going to work on is the sign up component. That way we can create users. So we're going to do a series of imports in order to get things ready for us to begin writing the HTML. So we're using Material UI to make things look nice and to handle some things for us so that we can focus solely on the React portion of this. So let's go ahead and get through these particular imports. So I'm going to copy these imports and I'm going to explain them. That way you can kind of understand what we're importing here. So the first one is form control. We're going to be using form control, which is a Material UI component. Input label, which is going to be for creating labels for our inputs. Input, which is going to be for our inputs specifically. Paper, which is basically a container that gives us a nice visual backdrop. With styles, which I'm going to explain in just a moment. CSS baseline, which is going to be the baseline CSS that we're importing from Material UI. Typography, which is just a component that lets us make specific typography. It makes it really easy to create typography. The button component, which we're going to use for our submit. And then we're also importing Firebase here. So let's go ahead and also import our styles file that we have. So if you remember, we created this styles.js file. Let's go ahead and import this. Import styles from, and then in quotes, you're going to want to put / which means the current directory, styles. So all of the code is going to be on GitHub, and I am going to be providing a link to it in the description below so that you can just copy a lot of this, because like I said, I don't really want to focus too much on the CSS and the Material UI aspect of this. I want it to be mostly on the React side. This just makes it really easy for us to do some styling. So I'm going to paste in from the styles.js file all of the styles that we're going to be using, and I'm going to explain what's going on here so that you can understand exactly what this is doing. So we have a function called styles, which takes a theme argument that's provided by Material UI. We're creating this function and it's returning an object, and inside of this object we have various parameters, and each of these is a class name. And for the class name we have some CSS styles that we're using, and then we're exporting this styles function. So when I save this, we're going to go back into here and we have this with styles function that's provided by Material UI. So I want you to highlight sign up component here in this export. I want you to cut it and I want you to put in with styles. And we're going to provide an argument called styles, and then we're going to add another set of parentheses directly after this, which immediately invokes this function. And we're going to, because basically this returns another function. So with styles returns a function, and then we're going to immediately invoke the function that it returns with sign up component. So just to make it easy, with styles, and then in parentheses put styles, and then in another set of parentheses directly after it put sign up component. And what that's doing is it's actually adding all of these styles as a property to our component. So each component in React actually has properties. You can pass properties into each component, and I'll show you exactly how to do custom properties very shortly. But for now, let's go ahead and take the property that's automatically added in with styles. That property is going to be called classes. And so we're going to use destructuring in order to access this variable, because we're going to be using this particular property a lot inside of our HTML. So normally, in order to access it, we would say this.props.classes. However, we don't want to write this.props a ton of times throughout this particular app. So we're just going to say const, and then inside of curly braces, we're going to say classes is equal to this.props, and all it's doing is it's destructuring. So it's pulling the classes property out of this.props, and it's assigning it to a variable called classes, so that we can say classes dot, and then for instance we have all of these here. We could say has account header, and now classes.has account header would be the same as saying this.props.classes.has account header. So for a quick demonstration of how this all works, inside of return, I'm going to go ahead and start putting in some HTML that we're actually going to be using. I'm going to create a main tag here, and I want to give it a class of main. But instead of putting class equals, we actually have to do class name inside of React, and it's essentially the same thing. And we want it to be main, but we're using this classes, this with styles thing that Material UI gives to us. So as you kind of saw in one of the earlier videos, you can actually put class name equals, you can put anything equals, and then when you put in curly braces inside of one of these files, you can put in some JavaScript such as 2 + 2. Although we don't want 2 + 2 to be the class name, what we want is classes dot, and we have inside of this styles object a class called main, and that's the object that's returned, so we can say classes dot main. And so now class name is equal to main. Great, so now that we have our main container here for our signup component, let's go ahead and add in the CSS baseline. So just add that in as if it were an HTML component. So now we have the CSS baseline. Under this, we're going to create a paper, and we'll go ahead and use that paper component. And we want to use the class name paper because inside of styles.js, we have this paper class with all these styles that will be applied to it if it has this class name. So we can just come in again and say class name is equal to, and then inside of curly braces, say classes dot paper. And now that this is saved, let's come over here and go to /signup to see what this looks like so far. Now you can see this is what the paper is. It's this, it sort of gives it some depth. It's a container that adds some sort of depth to the visual aspect of this. So this is what we have so far. Let's go ahead and put in the typography. So the typography, again, it's basically just an easy way to create typography or headers and paragraph tags, things like that. So we're going to do typography. That's going to be the tag. And inside of the opening tag, we're going to put a component. And we want this to be a header1 tag. And we're going to put a variant, and we're going to set that equal to h5. And the text that we want to add inside of this typography component is sign up. And when I save this, you can now see that sign up is here. Okay, so let's go ahead and start creating the form itself. So we're going to use a standard form tag, standard HTML form tag, and we're going to want to give it a class called form. So we're going to give it class name equals, and then in curly braces, classes dot form. So now it has the form class. Now we're also going to add a submit function. So whenever it gets submitted, we can call a function. So on submit, just like in normal HTML. Now inside of here, we're going to want to create a function that is called whenever we submit the form. So I'm going to actually create a anonymous function here, something that calls another function. And by default, the submit event is passed as an argument, and we want to call a function that we're going to create for this class specifically called submit signup. So I'm going to put this dot submit signup, and then we're going to pass that event into that function. So we don't have that function yet, so let's go ahead and create it now. Submit signup, and we're going to set it equal to a function. And then keep in mind, we have to remember that it takes that event parameter. So we'll go ahead and give it E. So for now, we're going to go ahead and go inside of this submit signup function, and we're just going to log a simple statement that says submitting. That way we can know it's happening, and we'll worry about the actual functionality in just a moment. So back up here to our HTML inside of the form tags, we're going to go ahead and create a form control. And we want to make this required, meaning that it's required in order to submit the form. And we'll make it full width so that it is the full width of the container or the paper. And then we'll set the margin equal to, and then in quotes, we're going to put normal. So it has a normal margin. Go ahead and close that tag. And inside of here, we're going to create our input label. So input label. And inside of the opening tag, we're going to go ahead and put HTML4. And that's the equivalent of 4 in normal HTML. And it's going to be sign up -email -input. And this is going to be the ID for our input. So the actual content that we want inside of this input label is going to be enter your email. So let's go ahead and actually create the input for this. So this is going to be an input tag with a capital I because we're using the one that comes with Material UI. And inside of the input tag, the opening input tag, we're going to put autocomplete is equal to, and we're going to put in here email. Now we're going to give it autofocus. That way it's automatically focused as soon as we load the page, since it's the first thing that we want the user to type in on the form. So we're going to give it that ID that I was talking about just a moment ago. So let's give it the ID. ID is equal to, and it's going to be the same thing that we put inside of this HTML4. So we'll go ahead and paste that in. And we're going to want an onChange function. So whenever the value of the input changes, in other words, whenever the user is typing, we're going to want to call a function. So we're going to say onChange, and again, put the curly braces. So we're going to create a function that takes the event by default, and we're going to pass it to our own function called this.userTyping. Now, user typing is going to take two arguments. It's going to take the type of input that the user is typing on, which in this case is going to be email, and it's also going to be taking the event. So I have email and e passed here. So let's go ahead and create this function called user typing, and then it's going to be equal to a function with e passed to it, but also we're going to want to call, we're going to create another one called type. So type and e, and then inside of here, we're just going to log both of these variables here, type and the event. Go ahead and save this. So now that you have this saved and you can see over here the input is over here, I want you to right click inside of your browser window and open up your console. I want you to clear it so there's nothing in it. Go ahead and focus on your input and start typing some stuff. You can see that those things are logged. You can see that email is the type of input that the user was typing on, and then here's the actual event. We're going to be using the target here to get the value from this input as the user's typing. So let's go ahead and finish up our form before we worry about the user typing and submit signup functions. So create another form control, and we are going to go inside of the opening tag, and we're going to make this required. We're going to make it full width, and again, we're going to make the margin equal to normal. Then inside of here, just like previously, we're going to create an input label, and we are going to want to do HTML4, and instead of email, sign up email input, we're going to set it equal to sign up password input. And then we are going to want to put the text inside of this label to be create a password. Let me make sure that's capitalized since it's a title. And then underneath this, we'll go ahead and create our input tag with a capital I. And inside of the opening tag, we're going to go ahead and say the type is equal to password, so that the password, as you're typing it, will not show as plain text, it'll show as dots. It's a little bit more secure. So we can put password here. And then we're going to want to do the ID. We'll set the ID equal to the HTML4 that we created right here. So go ahead and copy this in. And just like we did up here with the onChange, we're going to copy this over into here. But instead of user typing in the email, they're going to be typing in on the password input. So go ahead and save that. So let's go ahead and create our final input. So we'll copy this whole block here that we just created and paste it below. And then instead of HTML4 being password input, it'll be password-verification input. In fact, let's not call it verification, let's call it confirmation. And then we will do the same thing inside of password. We're going to say password confirmation in camel case, and then change the ID to confirmation as well. And now let's just go ahead and change this input label to be confirm your password. And so let's go ahead and save that. And you can see over here in the form, we have enter your email, create a password, and confirm your password, but we haven't yet added the button. So let's go ahead and quickly add the button. So that'll be a capital B for button, because that's going to be the one that's provided to us by Material UI. So the type is going to be equal to submit, so that it knows whenever you click that button, you'll be submitting the form. We'll go ahead and make it full width so that it matches the inputs. The variant is going to be equal to contained, and then the color we can actually put is equal to primary, which is going to give it a nice blue color. And then we are also going to want to add the class name, because inside of styles we have a class called, let's see, it's called submit, which is just going to be the styles for the submit button. So let's say class name is equal to, and then in these curly braces, classes dot submit, and then the text that we want inside of the button is just going to be submit. So let's save that, and we have an error. It's because I didn't close the tags properly, it seems. So let's see. Oh, it's supposed to be classes dot submit. So go ahead and save that, and now it compiles correctly. And as you can see, this form is starting to look really good. So at the below the form, in the case of the user already having an account and wanting to log in instead of signing up, we'll go ahead and add a couple of small things. So we'll create a typography here, and we're going to close it, and then this is going to be a component, and we're going to set that equal to, I think we're going to want to do an H5. So let's do H5, and then we'll set the variant equal to H6. And then what we will do is give this a class of has account header, because in here we have has account header. So we will go ahead and give that class name is equal to classes dot has account header. And then we're going to put inside of here already have an account with a question mark. And then below that, we're going to want the user to be able to click on that link. So in order to do that, we're going to have to import link. So import link from, and this is actually going to be from the router. So this is going to be from React router DOM. That way, when we click it, it will reroute us to the login page. So go ahead and use this link tag here with a capital L. And what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to set the text first to say login, and we'll do it enthusiastically with a exclamation point. And we're going to give it a class name. We have a class for it in our styles. We're going to call it classes.loginLink. And then we're going to want to put a 2. So 2 is equal to, and then the route that we want to go to, which is /login. So save that. It says we have an error. React router DOM does not contain a default export. So that is going to be, I must have, oh, I see what it is. So when we imported it, I actually want to destructure it. So put these curly braces around link just like this and save, and then this compilation error will go away. So let's see what happens when I click on the login link. You can see now it says hello world from login. So you know that this is actually directing us through the router as we were hoping it would. So now let's begin adding some state to our component. So we can create a constructor here just as we would inside of a normal class inside of JavaScript. We have to call the super function, which calls the parents constructor. And then we're going to create a variable called this.state, and it's going to be an object. And in here, we're going to have different properties or different things that we can set inside of the state. And whenever the state updates, it's going to re-render the component, and we're going to actually put some logic inside of there using the state. You'll see very shortly. So for now, just follow along. So the email we'll set to null by default, and then we'll have a password, and we'll set that to null by default. Password confirmation will be null by default. And then we're also going to have a sign up error, which by default we're going to make as an empty string. So let's see how we can use this state to kind of conditionally render some items inside of the component. So underneath the form and above the typography here, go ahead and put an enter, or put a space, and then I want you to put an open and closing curly bracket. Now remember, I said you can put JavaScript inside of here by using that. So we can actually put some JavaScript. So we're going to do an if statement, or actually what we're really going to do is a ternary operator that says this.state. So we can access the state by saying this.state dot, and then whatever piece of the state you want to access, which is sign up error. If this is an empty string, which an empty string in JavaScript is considered a falsy value, if it is an empty string, if it is not an empty string, so if there's something actually wrong, if we have a sign up error, which we're going to worry about later, we'll actually worry about populating that later. If there is a sign up error, we're going to want to create a typography tag. And inside of the opening typography tag here, we're going to put a class name set equal to classes.errorText. And the component is going to be an H5, and the variant is going to be an H6. So I'll just copy this from below. And the text that we're actually going to want to put inside of here is going to be, again, some JavaScript, the exact error that we have here. So if we have this sign up error, we want to display the sign up error inside of this typography tag. So we would say this.state.signup error inside of these curly braces. So we're just putting JavaScript in there. Now we have to continue this ternary operator. So if there is no sign up error, we're just going to return null here. So we actually won't get anything. So conditionally, we're going to be getting this typography tag by using JavaScript here. So when I save that, you can actually see that there is no sign up error here. That's because sign up error by default is an empty string. But if I come in here and say there was an error and I save it, you can see now it's showing the sign up error. So I'll simply remove this so that it's back to being an empty string by default like we would want. And what we will do now is we'll go ahead and start working on the user typing function. We're going to use a switch statement. So we're going to switch on the type. Now, depending on the type that we pass into user typing, we want to do certain things with the state. In the case of it being email, we want to set the state. We want to go back up here so I can show you. We want to set the email to whatever the user is typing inside of the email function. So the state, we want to set the state equal to whatever the user is typing inside of the email input. So what we will do is we will use a function that React gives us called this.setState. This.setState. And what we're going to do is we're going to pass a new object into setState that represents the chunk of state we want to update. And in this case, we only want to update the email. And we want to set that equal to e.target.value. So that event that we're passing in here is going to be the typing update. So basically the change update here from the email. And we want to set the state, the email state, equal to the e.target.value. So whatever the value of this input is at that time. And so I'm actually going to save this and demonstrate this in just a moment. So first, let's go ahead and continue building our user typing switch statement. So another case would be password. In the case of a password, we'll essentially do the exact same thing that we did with email, but we want to update a different portion of the state. Instead of updating the email portion of the state, we'll simply update the password portion of the state. And again, we'll go ahead and copy this and do the same thing with password verification. You just get everything indented properly, or sorry, it's password confirmation. And again, we'll set that equal to the e.target.value. And so now we have the ability to update our state. Let's see that in action. So in order to see this in action, what we're going to do is we're going to actually put some stuff inside of this submit sign up. So what we can do is we can first start by saying e.prevent default. And the reason why we're doing this is because by default, when we submit a form, it's going to refresh the page. We actually don't want to do that. We want to do some asynchronous stuff and then use the React DOM router to then route to the dashboard once it's successfully signed up. So for now, we want to just prevent the default functionality of the form instead of doing that. So when we submit, let's actually go ahead and console.log this.state so we can see the current state of the component when we submit the form. So I'm just going to put some random text inside of all of these, and then I'm going to click submit. And now you can see that it says submitting. And in here you can see the state, the email here, and the password that I created. But as you can see here, password confirmation is null. That's because up here we must have referenced the wrong thing. So what we did was inside of the switch statement, we put password twice. We put a case for password and we put another case for password. Instead, this should be password confirmation. So when I save this and we do this one more time, you can see that when I submit it, we actually have all of the state that we would expect. So one thing we're going to want to do is actually add a little bit of custom validation. So by default, since we put required for the inputs here, if I were to click submit, it's going to say, please fill out this field. And when I do that and I click submit, again, it's going to make me do that. And then when I click submit, it's going to make me do that, etc. But what we're not doing is we're not checking that confirm your password and password are the same. So we need a little bit of custom validation. So I'm going to create a function called form is valid. And that's going to be a function that checks whether or not this.state.password is equal to this.state.password confirmation. And so whenever we call form is valid, it's going to return true if these two things are equal. Otherwise, it will return false. And we're going to use this function inside of this submit signup function to make sure that we have a valid form first. Let's go down here to our submit signup function and let's get rid of this log statement. Instead, what we want to do is we want to first check whether or not this.form is valid. And we're going to say if not this.form is valid, so I'm going to add this unary operator right here to say if this is false, then what we want to do is we want to set the state. So this.setState And in here, the chunk of state that we want to update is sign up error. We want to say passwords do not match. And when I save that, let's watch this in action over here. So I'll type in an email, type in a password, and then I'll type in a password that does not match. And when I click submit, you can see now passwords do not match. So if this is the case, we actually don't want to continue inside of the function anymore. So let's just return. Now, if form does happen to be valid, we want to actually go ahead and call Firebase. We want to add the user to our authentication, and we also want to add the user inside of our database. So it's going to be two separate Firebase calls that we're going to be doing here. So in this tutorial, I'm going to be using both .then with promises and also async await so that you can kind of get a feel for both. Now, normally in an application, you're going to want to do either just one or the other, and you can decide on your own. But since this is a tutorial, I want to show both ways. That way you can get a good feeling for both. In this case, I'm going to use .then. So we're going to call Firebase, and we're going to use the auth method that Firebase provides, which also provides another method called create user with email and password. So I'm actually going to come to another line for all of this because some of these names get pretty long. So I'm going to just put these on a new line. You don't have to do this. Create username, create user with email and password. That's the name of the function. Now we're going to put the arguments inside of here. The first argument is the email. So we're going to say this.state.email. And the second argument is the password. So this.state.password. And then we're going to get a .then. So what we're doing is whenever this goes to Firebase, makes the call, and then whatever response we get from the server is going to happen inside of this .then function. And we're going to pass a function into .then that gets called whenever the response happens from the server. And we're going to give it an argument of auth res. And we want to do some stuff whenever we get the response from the auth. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is create an object called user object. And we're just going to set that equal to a very simple object that has a email. And we want to set that email equal to authres dot user dot email, because it's going to send back the authres, and that object that it sends back is going to have a user property, and that user property is going to have an email property. And we want to use that property to build an object that we're then going to send to our Firebase database. Because remember, we have two separate Firebase things that we're using. We're using authentication, and we're also using a database. So the first thing that we're doing is actually creating the user in the authentication module of Firebase. And then when we successfully create that user inside of the authentication module, we want to go ahead and add it to our database. So we're going to go ahead and create that user object like we just did, but now we're going to send it to our database. So with that being said, we're going to use Firebase again. I'm going to go to the next line and say .firestore, because that's the module name for the Firebase database that we're using, Firestore. We're going to access the collection. One of the collections that we created was actually called users, if you remember. We created users collection and also a chats collection. So we want to access the users collection. Now the document name that we want to create. So if we go back to Firebase right now, I can kind of show you this. If I go to Firebase, and let's go to the dashboard. This is kind of, I'll have to full screen this, sorry. If we go in here and I go to I am app tutorial, this is actually a different one than the one that I showed you originally. This is kind of a fully functional one. So you'll get to kind of see how this looks. Inside of users, you can see that the document name is going to be the user's email, and then the document is just going to contain an email property equal to email. So don't let that confuse you. That's fine. I just wanted to demonstrate that really quick so that you can understand what the document is. So the document is just going to be this.state.email, and then we're going to want to go to set, which is a function. So we're setting the document equal to the user object, which we created right here. So whenever that gets called and is successful, we're going to do whatever's inside of this then function. We don't really need an argument from it, so we're going to go ahead and create a function that just says this.props. Now remember, props are the properties that are passed to the component. There are automatic properties that are passed in from material, such as the styles. So whenever the classes, that's how we're able to access the classes object, is because it's a property that's passed in automatically. And another one that's passed in automatically in our case is going to be called history, which actually gets passed in automatically by the router. So if we go back to index.js really quick, I can show you that since we're using this routing object, it's going to automatically handle passing this history object to us. So we're going to say this.props.history, and we're going to push a / to it, which actually, let's do / dashboard. And what that means is it's going to redirect us to / dashboard. So whenever it successfully goes in and creates the user inside of auth, and then it goes in and successfully creates the user inside of the database, then it's going to push / dashboard to our history property, which is then going to redirect us to the dashboard, because if we go inside of index.js again, you can see that the path / dashboard will load the dashboard component. So that's what's going to be happening here when we do this. But actually, directly before doing that, let's actually handle some potential errors. So the first call that happens, we want to handle an error. This is going to be the database. This is not going to be the database. This is going to be the authorization aspect of Firebase. So we're going to call this auth error. And if we get an auth error, we want to do two things. We want to log to the console the fact that we got the error. So we'll go ahead and log the error to the console. And then we're also going to set state. We're going to set state. And the chunk of state that we're going to update is going to be that sign up error. So sign up error. We'll go ahead and set that equal to failed to add user. And we're going to do basically the exact same thing inside of the inner HTML call that we make here. So put a comma, and then instead of auth error, we're going to want to put DB error, because this is the call to the DB, the database. So inside of here, we'll put a console.log. Instead of auth error, it'll be DB error. And then again, we'll just update this date to say failed to add user. So when I save this, we get an error because it's not DB ERR, it's DB ERROR. Sorry about that. That's probably confusing. I should make these match, so I'll go ahead and make these match so that it's not inconsistent. And I'll save it. And let's see what happens if I just type in some random nonsense. And I click submit. It says failed to add user, and that means that it went to the Firebase, it tried to add the user, there was some error in Firebase and we couldn't add it because this is not a real email address. And so it sent back an error, and we handled that error by saying this.setState and showing to the user that we in fact had an error and that they should try again with an actual email address. So let's try doing this really quick. Let's try creating a user. Let's see what happens. So when I click submit, let's see what happens here. It actually created a user and it directed us to the dashboard just as we'd expect. So let's go look at Firebase and see what the user looks like that we just created. So now I'm back at my Firebase console here at the website, and I'm going to go to the authentication tab, and you can see now that in our authentication section of Firebase, we actually have a new user called zach@portexe.com. And when I go to the database here, you can see that under users, there was a new document called zach@portexe that was added with a field here, with an email field that says zach@portexe.com. So we know that this was actually successful. We know that this successfully both added it to our auth and added it to our database. So when you create users in here, you can use any name you want at portexe.com. We're not actually going to be sending any emails. This is just a way to create a username. So you can use any email you want. You can use your own email. And if you want to create multiple users, you can use any email you want at portexe.com. It's perfectly fine to do that. So in this video, we created the signup component, and we went ahead and actually made the ability to create users inside of Firebase, and then it will redirect us to the dashboard component when you've created a user successfully. So if you liked this video, please give me a thumbs up, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next video.